A routine traffic stop turned into something much darker when two white officers in Virginia framed a black woman. Unaware she was a CIA agent. What should have been a simple pull-over quickly escalated into a carefully orchestrated setup. However, the officers had no idea that their target was not just any woman. She possessed the power to expose everything they thought they controlled. This story takes a shocking twist, unraveling a web of lies and corruption, and ending with a revelation so explosive it would shake the entire police department to its core. Thank you for being with us. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on the next meaningful stories. We have another impactful story coming your way tomorrow. The night was calm in Arlington, Virginia, with the faint hum of streetlights casting shadows over empty sidewalks and the occasional car speeding by. Talia Porter, behind the wheel of her sleek black SUV, was relaxed as she drove through the quiet suburban streets. Glancing at her watch, she noted it was just past midnight. Though the day had been long, she felt a small sense of accomplishment, knowing her undercover work in the small town was nearly finished, and she had everything she needed for a clean exit. As she approached an intersection, she slowed, her sharp eyes catching the glint of a reflective stop sign. Talia, with years of field experience, instinctively knew something was off. She brought her car to a complete stop and then turned left onto another street. Moments later, the sudden flash of blue and red lights illuminated her rearview mirror, followed by the shrill wail of a siren, breaking the night's calm. Talia's heart didn't race. She was trained for this. Her mind sharpened, and her breathing remained steady. She glanced in the mirror and saw the squad car getting closer, its headlights casting long shadows on her dashboard. Calmly, she guided her SUV to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and retrieved her license and registration from the glove compartment. The patrol car stopped behind her, its lights still flashing. Talia observed the two officers stepping out with deliberate movements. Officer Brandon Carter, tall with a square jaw, and Officer Mark Sullivan, shorter and stockier. "Good evening, ma'am," Officer Carter said, his voice carrying authority as he leaned down, shining his flashlight into her window. "You know why I pulled you over tonight?" Talia kept her expression neutral. "No, officer," she responded evenly. "I wasn't speeding, and I made a full stop at the intersection." A slight, condescending smile appeared on Carter's lips. "Actually, you failed to stop at that sign back there," he said. "That's a moving violation." Talia furrowed her brow slightly, but kept her composure. "I'm certain I stopped, officer," she replied calmly. "If you're mistaken, license and registration." Carter cut her off, his tone hardening. Without hesitation, Talia handed over her documents, slow and deliberate. She wasn't interested in escalating the situation unnecessarily. Carter inspected the papers, his eyes lingering on her license. "Virginia plates, local address," he muttered almost to himself, then louder, "You live around here?" Talia nodded. "Yes, officer." Suddenly, Officer Sullivan, who had been near the rear of the vehicle, called out, "Carter, you might want to take a look back here." Carter straightened and passed Talia's documents back without a word. "Stay in the car," he ordered, then walked toward the trunk with Sullivan. Talia's jaw tightened as she observed them through the side mirror. Sullivan was pointing at something, and their voices dropped to a low, conspiratorial murmur. Carter nodded, and the two exchanged a look that sent a subtle warning through her. It wasn't fear, just a sharp, instinctual alert. Moments later, Carter returned to the window, his expression grim. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Talia tilted her head slightly, her voice calm. "May I ask why, officer?" "We have reason to believe you're in possession of illegal substances," Carter replied, his tone abrupt and rehearsed. Talia's eyes narrowed. "Illegal substances?" she repeated. "I think you've made a mistake." "We'll see about that," Carter said, gesturing for her to exit the car. Sullivan was already waiting at the rear of her vehicle, his face smirking with satisfaction. Suppressing a sigh, Talia opened the door and stepped out. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as though she had all the time in the world. She stood, hands at her sides, as Sullivan theatrically opened the trunk and pointed to a small, unmarked bag sitting conspicuously at the edge. "There it is," Sullivan said with mock surprise. "A bag of powdery goodness." Talia's eyes flicked to the bag and then back to the officers, her face unreadable, but her mind racing. She was certain the bag wasn't there when she left her house. This was a setup. Carter moved closer, his smirk widening. "Anything you want to tell us, ma'am?" Talia's lips curved into a faint smile, a calculated expression that conveyed neither guilt nor fear. "I'll save my comments for the appropriate setting," she said. Carter chuckled, interpreting her calm demeanor as arrogance. "Oh, you'll have your chance," he said. "You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute." As Sullivan moved to cuff her, Talia allowed it. Her gaze remained steady and unflinching. "You're making a big mistake," she said quietly, her voice carrying a subtle intensity that made Sullivan hesitate for half a second before snapping the cuffs into place. "Yeah, we'll see," Carter said, leading her to the squad car. "Let's see how confident you are in front of a judge." As they drove to the station, Talia gazed out the window, already strategizing. The officers might have thought they scored an easy arrest, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. The drive to the station was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Talia sat in the back seat, her hands cuffed behind her. Her expression remained neutral as the fluorescent streetlights painted fleeting shadows across her face. Her thoughts were sharp, methodical, as she replayed every detail of the encounter like assembling a puzzle. The stop sign that didn't exist, the smug confidence of the officers, the planted bag. It wasn't a random act of corruption, but a deliberate choice. Officer Carter glanced at her in the rearview mirror, a faint smirk on his lips. "You don't seem too worried," he said, his voice edged with mockery. "Should I be?" Talia met his gaze through the mirror, unflinching. Carter chuckled and shook his head. "You're either brave or stupid," he said. "I've seen a lot of people act tough, but it never lasts long in the holding cell." Talia didn't respond. She didn't need to. She knew men like Carter well. Used to power, bending the rules, and walking away without consequence. For now, she let him believe he was in control. That illusion wouldn't last long. When they arrived at the station, the night shift officers barely looked up from their desks as Carter and Sullivan led her inside. The harsh fluorescent lights cast a cold, unforgiving glow on the scuffed linoleum floors. "We got ourselves a big one tonight," Carter announced loudly, drawing the attention of the other officers. Sullivan tossed the bag of powder onto the counter with a dramatic flourish. "Caught her red-handed," he added. "Looks like she's been running more than stop signs." Talia remained silent, her gaze sweeping the room. She took note of every camera's position, the layout of the desks, and the casual camaraderie among the officers. It was a small station where everyone knew everyone, a network of unspoken codes and shared secrets. They led her to a fingerprinting station, where Carter removed the cuffs and motioned for her to place her hands on the ink pad. She complied without a word, her movements calm and controlled. The officer working the station, a tired-looking young man, hesitated as he glanced at her. "Name?" he asked, his tone almost apologetic. "Talia Porter," she replied evenly. "Occupation." Talia hesitated for the briefest moment, considering her answer. "Consultant." She finally spoke, her words vague enough to avoid suspicion, but truthful enough to prevent outright deceit. The young officer nodded, continuing to type, though his unease was evident. Carter and Sullivan, on the other hand, were oblivious to the tension, chuckling quietly as they leaned against the counter, enjoying the scene. Talia's voice cut through their laughter like a blade, drawing both officers' attention and momentarily unsettling their smirks. "You've got a smart mouth," Carter remarked, his tone darkening. "Let's see how funny you are after a night in lockup." Talia's cell was cold and poorly lit, the metal bench bolted to the wall providing little comfort. Long shadows from the bars stretched across the concrete floor, while the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead added to the sterile atmosphere. She sat upright on the bench, her back straight, her posture unyielding. The door slammed shut behind her with a harsh clang, its sound echoing down the silent corridor. Carter lingered a moment, his eyes lingering on her with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "You don't look like the type to get mixed up in this kind of thing," he said conversationally. "But don't worry, the courts love a good sob story. Maybe they'll go easy on you." Talia tilted her head slightly, her gaze locking onto his. "Or maybe they'll see through yours," she replied, her tone calm yet sharp, making Carter shift uncomfortably. He muttered something under his breath before walking away, leaving her alone in the cell. Talia leaned back against the cold metal wall, exhaling slowly. She knew the next steps had to be precise. This wasn't just about her freedom. She was about to expose something far larger. The silence in the cell was broken only by the faint hum of the station's HVAC system. Hours passed, but Talia didn't sleep. She never did during missions. Her mind remained sharp, constantly calculating and anticipating. The quiet buzz of voices drifted from the hallway outside her cell, signaling the beginning of the day's shift. She listened carefully, noting the distinct tones of the officers' footsteps, subtle clues revealing more about the people working at the station. The sharp buzz of the cell block door unlocking echoed down the hall, followed by the sound of heavy boots. Talia remained motionless, her eyes fixed ahead, her expression calm. When Officer Sullivan appeared in front of her cell holding a clipboard, his usual smirk plastered across his face, he spoke in a falsely cheerful tone. "Morning, sunshine. Sleep okay? Or was the cot not soft enough for you?" Talia met his gaze without responding, her silence unsettling him more than he realized. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at his clipboard. "You've got a bail hearing this afternoon," he said, tapping the paper with his pen. "But between you and me, I wouldn't get your hopes up. Judges around here don't take too kindly to drug traffickers." She tilted her head, her expression unwavering. "Good to know," she replied softly. Sullivan frowned, his confident smirk faltering for a brief moment before he cleared his throat and stepped back. "Enjoy your breakfast," he muttered before turning on his heel and walking away. Talia leaned back against the wall again, her gaze following him until he disappeared down the hallway. The cracks in their confidence were beginning to show. All she needed now was a little more time. At the front desk, Officer James Keller, young and fresh out of the academy, couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He'd processed dozens of arrests, but this one felt different. The suspect, Talia Porter, didn't react like anyone he'd ever seen. She wasn't defiant, aggressive, or scared. She was calm, composed, and deliberate with her words. And then there was the bag of drugs. It was too convenient, placed right there in the trunk, as if it had been waiting for her. Keller hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He knew the unwritten rules of the station. You didn't question senior officers. But something was gnawing at him. He glanced at the surveillance monitors showing Talia in her cell. She was sitting still, as if meditating, her expression unreadable. Keller bit his lip, a spark of resolve flickering within him. While Keller wrestled with his conscience, Talia made her move. Her hands rested casually in her lap, but her sharp eyes were focused on the camera just outside her cell. The surveillance equipment was old, likely outdated, and poorly maintained, typical for a station on a tight budget. She waited until the hallway cleared, then subtly shifted on the bench, activating a small, inconspicuous tracker hidden in her jacket hem. The device sent a silent signal, a beacon that would reach her team within moments. They wouldn't need an explanation. They would know exactly what to do. Meanwhile, in the break room, Carter and Sullivan were enjoying their coffee, laughing over the morning paper. "She probably thinks she's untouchable," Sullivan remarked, shaking his head. "Did you see her face? Not even a flicker of panic." "Well, that'll change," Carter replied with a smirk. "She's just another name in the system now. No one's going to dig too deep." Sullivan nodded. "We've got everything we need, airtight evidence." Neither officer noticed the young officer from the processing desk lingering nearby, his face pale, his eyes darting toward the holding cells. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him, but he kept his mouth shut. In this station, questioning senior officers wasn't just frowned upon. It was dangerous. Back in her cell, Talia closed her eyes, her breathing steady. Hours passed, but she didn't sleep. She didn't need to. Every minute brought her closer to the moment when everything would fall apart. The storm was coming, and Talia was the eye of it, still and focused. A pale sliver of dawn filtered through the narrow window of her holding cell, casting a muted glow on the cold concrete walls. The station was waking up. Talia hadn't moved much during the night, sitting upright on the metal bench with half-closed eyes, as if meditating. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford during missions. Her mind was sharper this way, constantly calculating, always alert. A loud buzz signaled the unlocking of the cell block door, followed by the sound of heavy boots echoing down the corridor. Talia didn't flinch as Officer Sullivan appeared in front of her cell, his usual smirk in place. "Morning, sunshine," he said mockingly. "Sleep okay? Or was the cot not soft enough for you?" Talia met his gaze without saying a word. Her silence unnerved him more than he realized. He glanced down at his clipboard. "You got a bail hearing this afternoon," he said, tapping the paper with his pen. "But I wouldn't get your hopes up. Judges around here don't take kindly to drug traffickers." She tilted her head slightly, her expression unwavering. "Good to know," she replied softly. Sullivan frowned, his smirk faltering for a split second before he cleared his throat and turned away, muttering under his breath. Talia watched him leave, the cracks in their facade beginning to show. She needed just a little more time. He paused outside her cell, his expression conflicted. "You said they're counting on people like me," he said quietly. "What did you mean by that?" Talia's gaze remained steady as she replied. "You know exactly what I mean." She added, "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Keller stared at her for a long moment before walking away, his shoulders tense. Back in the operations room, the suited man observed Keller's retreat on the monitor. A faint smile crossed his lips. "He's close," he said, his voice low. "One more push." One of the agents glanced at him, then the man's smile widened. "Then we turn this whole thing upside down." Keller sat at his desk, drumming his fingers against the edge as he stared at his monitor. Talia Porter's digital file remained open, the words blurring as his mind churned. A knot began to form in his chest, a growing unease that had been creeping up since the arrest. Something wasn't right, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. He glanced over toward the break room, where Carter and Sullivan were still laughing. Their carefree demeanor grated against the tension he felt. The station felt heavier than usual, as though the walls were pressing in, silently witnessing something unspoken. His thoughts wandered back to the holding cell, to Talia's words. "That's what they're counting on." Her voice had been calm and deliberate, as if she knew exactly which buttons to press. And maybe she did. But was she wrong? As the hours dragged on, Keller's doubt slowly turned into quiet resolve. He needed answers, but he couldn't risk drawing attention to himself. His rookie status had already made him a target for teasing, and any sign of insubordination could isolate him further. Waiting for the right moment, Keller slipped into the records archive after Carter and Sullivan left the room. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting long shadows across the rows of filing cabinets and computer terminals. Keller logged into the system, his hands trembling slightly as he searched for past cases tied to Carter and Sullivan. Their names popped up repeatedly, attached to arrests that followed a disturbingly familiar pattern: minor traffic violations escalating into drug charges. Most of the defendants were people of color, and most were convicted. The knot in his chest tightened. Back in her cell, Talia remained still, her body a picture of composure. She had spent years training her mind to stay focused during moments like this when the waiting was long and the stakes were high. Through the bars, she watched Keller's shadow move past her cell. His pacing had slowed, his steps more deliberate. She could sense his internal struggle, the quiet conflict brewing inside him. He was close to breaking the cycle of blind loyalty that men like Carter and Sullivan relied on. She shifted slightly on the bench, letting her movements catch his attention. He stopped, turning to face her. "Officer Keller," she said, her voice soft but commanding. He hesitated, his hand gripping the edge of the wall as if it were a lifeline. "What?" he asked, his voice low and almost offensive. You've seen something, haven't you? She asked, tilting her head. Something that doesn't add up. Keller swallowed hard. I can't. He stopped, his voice catching. I'm just trying to do my job. And what is your job exactly? Talia pressed. To follow orders? To look the other way when you know something's wrong? Keller's jaw tightened as his eyes darted down the hallway. You don't understand how things work around here, he said. I understand more than you think, Talia replied, her gaze unwavering. I know what it's like to feel trapped, to think you don't have a choice. But you do, Keller. You always have a choice. Keller walked away, but her words followed him like a shadow. He returned to his desk, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He stared at the list of cases tied to Carter and Sullivan. His stomach twisted with each new name he read. Finally, he made a decision. Keller opened a secure email channel and typed a message, his fingers moving quickly as his resolve solidified. He attached the case files he had found, along with a note. To whom it may concern, there's something wrong in this station. I don't know who else to turn to. Please help. He hit send, his heart pounding as the message disappeared into the void. He didn't know who would receive it or if they would even care, but it was the first step toward doing what he knew was right. In the break room, Carter leaned back in his chair, his coffee cup resting on his knee. You notice Keller acting weird today? He asked, glancing at Sullivan. Sullivan shrugged. Kids are always weird. What's he going to do? Rat us out. Carter smirked, but his eyes narrowed. Still, keep an eye on him. Last thing we need is some rookie poking his nose where it doesn't belong. That afternoon, as the station hummed with activity, a nondescript black sedan pulled into the parking lot. Inside the car, Talia's team prepared for their next move. They had intercepted Keller's email exactly as planned, and now they had what they needed to proceed. Let's make this clean, the team leader said, adjusting his tie. No unnecessary disruptions. We need to expose this from the inside. As they stepped out of the car, the sun glinted off their badges. FBI, one of the agents announced. Inside the station, Talia smiled faintly as the door opened and the agents walked in. She couldn't see them from her vantage point, but she didn't need to. She knew her team had arrived. The storm was no longer brewing. It was here. The hum of the station fell into an awkward silence as the front doors opened. The agents stepped inside, their movements measured and purposeful. Their black suits were crisp, and their badges gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The lead agent, a tall man with graying hair and a stern expression, approached the front desk. Officer Keller froze mid-typing, his heart racing. He wasn't sure if it was fear or relief or both. He watched as the lead agent leaned over the desk, speaking quietly enough that the surrounding officers couldn't hear. What's this about? The desk sergeant asked, his voice wary. Federal investigation, the agent replied, his voice steady and clipped. We need access to your records and holding cells immediately. The sergeant hesitated, exchanging a glance with a nearby officer. The FBI's sudden arrival was unusual and disruptive, but there was no protocol for outright denial. Fine, he muttered, gesturing toward the hallway. Follow me. From his desk, Keller watched the exchange, his palms slick with sweat. He knew deep down that the email he sent had triggered this, but he hadn't expected a response so soon or so visible. His gaze flicked toward Carter and Sullivan, who were standing near the break room door. Their laughter had died, replaced by hushed whispers and furrowed brows. Carter's eyes locked onto Keller for a split second before the rookie quickly looked away, focusing on his screen. The air in the station had changed, thick with tension. Agent Daniel Price, the lead investigator, stepped into a small, dimly lit interrogation room with his team. A second agent rolled in a cart carrying a portable server and several hard drives. They wasted no time plugging into the station's network and began sifting through its digital archives. Price leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching as lines of code and file names scrolled across the monitor. Anything? He asked the tech agent, a sharp-eyed woman. She nodded. Plenty. Their case files are riddled with inconsistencies, repeated arrests, identical narratives, gaps in procedure. This isn't just bad policing, it's systemic. Price's jaw tightened. Pull everything. I want every record, every report, and every piece of evidence tied to those two. In her cell, Talia heard the faint murmur of activity beyond the hallway. She could feel the shift, the subtle ripple that signaled her team's presence. The waiting was almost over. She shifted slightly on the bench, her hands resting in her lap. The cuffs she had worn earlier had left faint red marks on her wrists, but she paid them no mind. Her focus was on the moment ahead, the moment when the truth would no longer be hidden. Back in the break room, Carter paced back and forth, his coffee forgotten on the counter. Sullivan leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, watching his partner with growing unease. "You think this is about her?" Sullivan asked, his voice low. Carter stopped, glaring at him. "Of course it's about her. Why else would the feds be here?" Sullivan shifted uncomfortably. "You think they know?" Carter scoffed, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Know what? There's nothing to know. Everything we did was by the book." "Yeah," Sullivan muttered, "sure." Agent Price emerged from the interrogation room, flanked by two other agents. He carried a folder filled with printed reports, the weight of the evidence in his hands. He made his way through the station, his expression unreadable, and approached the bullpen. His gaze locked onto Carter and Sullivan, who froze mid-conversation. The agents moved with purpose, positioning themselves like sentinels around the room. "Officers Brandon Carter and Mark Sullivan," Price said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "We need to speak with you." Carter tried to play it cool, forcing a smirk as he stepped forward. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone casual. "We've got nothing to hide." Price didn't blink. "Good. Then you won't mind answering a few questions." The room fell silent as the agents led Carter and Sullivan toward the interrogation room they had occupied moments earlier. Keller watched the scene unfold, his heart pounding. He could see the cracks forming in Carter's facade, the tension in Sullivan's shoulders. The once confident duo now looked like cornered animals. Minutes later, another agent arrived at Talia's cell. The door buzzed open, and the agent stepped inside, his face neutral but his tone respectful. "Miss Porter," he said, "you're free to go." Talia stood, her movements smooth and deliberate. She met the agent's gaze, nodding slightly as she stepped out of the cell. The hallway seemed brighter now, the oppressive weight of the station lifting as she walked toward the front desk. As Talia passed by Keller's desk, their eyes met briefly. He opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated, the words caught in his throat. She stopped and turned to face him fully. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying an unspoken understanding. Keller's chest tightened. He gave a small nod, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. He didn't know what would come next, but for the first time since joining the force, he felt like he had done something that mattered. The interrogation room doors closed behind Carter and Sullivan, and the sound of raised voices soon followed. Talia watched from the station's entrance as the agents methodically dismantled the officers' lies. The storm she had waited for was finally here, and it was only the beginning. Inside the cramped interrogation room, Carter and Sullivan sat at a small metal table, their postures stiff. Agent Price stood across from them, his hands resting on a stack of documents. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead light. "So," Price began, his tone measured, "do you want to start with the arrest report, or should we jump straight to the planted evidence?" Sullivan flinched, his eyes darting toward Carter. "We don't know what you're talking about," Carter said firmly, his voice laced with defiance. Price didn't flinch. Instead, he opened the folder, pulling out a series of printed photos. He slid them across the table one by one. Images from the station security cameras showing Carter and Sullivan holding the unmarked bag before Talia's car was searched. Carter's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "That doesn't prove anything," he said. "We were securing evidence." Price raised an eyebrow and leaned forward slightly. "Really? Because these timestamps show otherwise. And we have audio recordings, courtesy of Miss Porter's hidden surveillance device. It captured your little conversation about how easy it would be to frame her." Sullivan paled, his hands gripping the edge of the table. You can't use that," he sputtered. "That's entrapment." Price smirked, shaking his head. "No, it's justice. And it's just the tip of the iceberg. We've pulled records from your past arrests, dozens of cases with eerily similar patterns. All of them are under review. But let me make one thing clear. You're not walking out of here today. Carter's bravado began to crumble. His shoulders sagged. Sullivan buried his face in his hands, the weight of their actions finally hitting him. Meanwhile, in the bullpen, Keller sat at his desk, watching the scene unfold. He had been called into the interrogation room earlier to confirm details about the station's processes. For the first time, he felt the heavy gaze of Carter and Sullivan as they realized someone from within had spoken out. As the agents returned to the bullpen, Keller stood, his hands trembling slightly. He approached Agent Price, clearing his throat. "What happens now?" he asked. Price looked at him, his expression softening slightly. "Now we clean house. And you?" He paused, studying Keller's face. "You did the right thing." Keller nodded, a small wave of relief washing over him. For the first time since joining the force, he felt a sense of purpose. Talia stood near the station's entrance, watching as Carter and Sullivan were escorted out in handcuffs. The once smug officers now looked defeated, their eyes downcast. They were escorted past their colleagues, who exchanged stunned glances. The reality of the situation sank in. Agent Price approached Talia, his expression neutral but respectful. "Everything we need is in place," Price said with a respectful nod. "Your work here is done." Talia nodded, her composure unwavering. "Good, make sure it sticks." Price gave a faint smile. "It will." As Talia stepped outside, the cool air met her face, carrying with it a sense of finality. The weight that had burdened her for weeks lifted, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of knowing that justice had prevailed. In the days that followed, the fallout from the investigation rocked the town. Carter and Sullivan's arrests made headlines, their faces plastered across every screen. The charges against Talia were officially dropped, and the cases linked to the officers' misconduct were reopened. The police station underwent a major overhaul, with several officers resigning under scrutiny. Keller, now viewed as a whistleblower, received mixed reactions from his colleagues, but he held his head high, knowing he had made the right choice. Weeks later, Talia sat on a park bench with a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. The autumn leaves rustled around her, their vibrant colors a reminder of change. She had returned to her quiet life, her mission complete, but the experience still lingered in her mind. Agent Price joined her, a rare moment of camaraderie between them. "You could have handled this differently," he said, sitting down beside her. Talia smirked, taking a sip of her coffee. "And missed the look on their faces?" "No thanks." Price chuckled softly. "You've got a knack for making things memorable." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the weight of their work momentarily forgotten. For Talia, the storm had passed, but the impact of her actions would continue to ripple, ensuring that justice prevailed, at least for now. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours of Carter and Sullivan's arrest, every local and national outlet had picked up the story. Police corruption exposed, FBI takes down dirty cops in Arlington. The bold headline flashed across major news sites, and footage of the officers being led out in handcuffs played on a loop. Their faces, grim and stripped of the arrogance they had worn so openly, were on full display. Talia Porter's name was intentionally kept out of the media, a calculated decision by her team. The focus needed to remain on the systemic issues at the station and the actions of the officers involved, not on her role in uncovering the truth. She preferred it that way. She had no interest in fame, only in results. In a sterile, windowless interrogation room at a federal detention center, Carter and Sullivan sat across from their lawyers. Their arrogance had melted into desperation, replaced by the grim reality of their situation. The charges against them were overwhelming: falsifying reports, planting evidence, and abusing their authority in dozens of cases. "This is bad," Sullivan muttered, his voice shaking. "They've got everything: audio, video, the files. What do we do?" Carter, usually the more confident of the two, sat in silence, his jaw clenched. "We fight it," he said finally, though the conviction in his voice was weak. Their lawyers weren't optimistic. The mountain of evidence was insurmountable, and public outrage had already tipped the scales against them. Plea bargains were their only chance to avoid decades in prison. Back at the Arlington Police Department, the fallout continued. Internal investigations revealed more officers involved in similar practices, and resignations flooded in as higher-ups scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. The chief of police held a press conference, emphasizing a commitment to transparency and reform, but the damage to the department's reputation was already done. Keller found himself at the center of attention, both praised and ostracized for his role in exposing the corruption. Some colleagues avoided him, their loyalty to the old guard still intact, while others quietly expressed their support. Keller didn't care. He had done what was right, and that was enough. A week after her release, Talia met Keller at a small diner on the outskirts of town. The atmosphere was quiet, almost serene, a stark contrast to the chaos they had both endured. Keller sat across from her, fidgeting with his coffee cup. "I wasn't sure you'd show up," he admitted, his voice low. Talia raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You earned this conversation," she said. "Not many people would have done what you did." Keller looked down at the table, his expression conflicted. I couldn't keep looking the other way," he said. "But honestly, I don't know if it made a difference. The department's still a mess, and people like Carter and Sullivan, there are more of them out there. It made a difference to the people they hurt," Talia replied firmly. "And it made a difference to you. Don't underestimate that." Her words seemed to ease some of his tension, and for the first time, he allowed himself a small smile. "What about you?" he asked. "What happens now?" Talia leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Now, I move on to the next mission. There's always another fight." Months later, Carter and Sullivan stood in court, their fates sealed. They pled guilty to multiple charges, each receiving a lengthy prison sentence. Their careers were over, their reputations destroyed. For the first time, they faced the consequences of their actions. The cases they had built on lies were overturned, and innocent people were exonerated. Community leaders rallied for deeper reforms, using the scandal as a catalyst for change. In a quiet moment, Talia sat in her sparsely furnished apartment, packing a small bag. A dossier lay open on the table, filled with details of her next assignment. She glanced at it briefly before closing it, her mind already focused on the road ahead. The phone on the counter buzzed, and she picked it up. Agent Price's voice came through the line. "Ready for the next one?" Talia smiled faintly. "Always." As she stepped out into the crisp evening air, the door clicked shut behind her. The fight wasn't over. Not for her, nor for the people she worked to protect. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served, and the truth had prevailed. And for her, that was enough. And so, the truth came to light, and justice was served. The corrupt officers who thought they could escape their crimes faced the consequences of their actions, while the woman they tried to frame emerged victorious, stronger than ever. This story reminds us that no matter how deep the lies, the truth will always find a way to shine through. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more gripping tales like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means the world and helps bring these stories to life. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.